Hi, greetings from Mars. My name is Brent Lavasser, and I'm the creator of Aoleon The Martian Girl. And today I wanted to take some time to respond to some questions that Chris Lawson asked me to respond to for his blog. He is a top 500 Amazon reviewer who reviewed my book, gave me a great review. Thank you, Chris. The first question he asked was right here. The first thing that hits me when reading Aoleon is the eye-popping graphics, and there are a ton of them. Thank you. That's a nice compliment. How did you go about learning to produce such stunning artwork? Well, this process of creating 3D art started way back in like 2002, 2003, and it was really a project that started out wanting to learn, how to model texture and render in 3D. And I started out in a program called Lightwave, which had been around since, I don't know, early 90s on the video toaster. And it was used for making television shows like Star Trek and or like the Next Generation one and Voyager and a couple others, as well as like it was used extensively for Battlestar Galactica, the latest series of shows, which were really popular on the Sci-Fi Channel. Anyway, so that was where I started out in Lightwave, and I used that for about, I don't know, a year. And then another program came out, which is called Modo, which is what I'm showing you right now on the screen. And basically, Modo was created by the former founders of NewTek's Lightwave. They basically left NewTek and went on to form their own company called Luxology. And over a 10-year period, they started with Modo 101, which was just a modeling application. And that's where I sort of jumped on board. Even though I was new to 3D and Lightwave and so on, I noticed that a lot of the people that were using Lightwave started to try Modo as a modeler. And there were a lot of things about the Lightwave modeler that I didn't like. And so I decided to give Modo a try, and I was pleasantly surprised at how easy it was just to model pretty much anything. And it was a lot easier than Lightwave, actually. And that sort of got me hooked on Modo. And over a 10-year period between like 2000, what was it, 3 or 4 when Modo first came out, to just, this year, which is when, or like last year when Modo 801 came out, there's been incredible development over that period of time. So it started out as a modeler, and then it went to rendering. It added, rendering, an amazing renderer, which is basically the technology behind what you're seeing right now, creating the rendered image. And then they added like painting, which is like being able to paint your model. So here's Aoleon in 3D. I can spin around her. You can zoom in. You can see the polygons. Each one of those little squares is what's called a polygon. Like if I click polygon here, I can select some of her polygons. I can hide her suit. You can see her head. This is, her face. And I can put that back. Anyway, so each piece of clothing, each body part, everything is modeled in 3D in Modo. And as you can see, there's polygons, and you have to create what's called edge loops, which is basically the flow of the model. Each one of these things are an edge, and it basically forms the contour of the model. You can see there's a mistake right there with her skin coming through the suit. Anyway, so that's modeling. And then what you do once you've created your model is you take it and you texture it. And over here is what you have is called the render tree, or the shader tree. And in the shader tree, you've got all your materials, which is basically what creates the color on each of the models. Like for example, for this one, her spacesuit, I double click on that and it takes you to this texture right here, which shows you her basic color for the spacesuit. That part of the spacesuit. You can see it's blue. It has a diffuse color of blue. a specular color of white, and slight reflection, and so on. So that's basically the the texturing part of it. Then you have what's called rendering, where once you're ready, you have your scene ready to go, you click render, and it renders. And basically what it does is it creates your final image. I'm not going to sit here and wait for it to render because this is going to take a while. But anyway, that's basically what rendering is. So that in a nutshell, that's what I had to learn to create my character. So every character in my book, like, when you see Gilbert, when you see Aoleon, when you see Zoot, Biswat, the Draconians, all of the characters were modeled. Every character had to be created. And so that's what took me so long, as well as the environments like the Martian megalopolis. Like, for example, here's Zoot. I'll just open up Zoot real quick. Let's see here. Zoot. So you can see Zoot here in 3D. This is what's over here is what's called a wireframe model, where you can see through the polygons, and it's just basically the lines that make up the polygons. And then over here you have the OpenGL view, which is like the real-time shaded view. And then here is the rendered view, and it's taking a little while to render because Zoot has a lot of hair, and hair takes a long time to render because it's very polygon intensive. And you can see, if I open my activity monitor, you can see how much CPU time and memory is being taken up as it's running. Anyway, so that's basically Modo in a nutshell. And I started learning that in like 2004, 2005, somewhere in there. I think it was around there. And luckily, a lot of the tutorials that were available for Lightwave 3D, which is what I originally started on, made it easy to transition to Modo. So the stuff that I learned there, even though it was like beginner stuff, transitioned very well to Modo. And then later on, there were a lot of great tutorials that were created by some of the experts, like some of the pros that were doing it, using Modo. And I just gobbled up all the tutorials that I could possibly get my hands on, as well as I spent a long time in the on the online forum, which is probably the most helpful. The Luxology, or now called the Foundry, online forum was probably the best resource I had to learn 3D, because there you had a whole bunch of really experienced artists that are pros. Basically, they do this professionally. Like, for me, it was just a hobby, and I just spent tons of time on there asking all kinds of questions and just reading what everyone was saying and just learning as much as I possibly could from everyone there. And basically I got like a full-on education on 3D on that forum primarily. I mean, it was an incredible learning resource. So kudos to Luxology and now the Foundry for providing that, because it's just an amazing resource for anyone that wants to learn 3D and anyone that is interested in using Modo. So the community is incredibly supportive. Even it doesn't matter what level of artist you are, whether you're a beginner like I was, just a first-time user. You can see Zoot just rendered there in the screen. Anyway, so it doesn't matter what level you're at. There's lots of great tutorials. Like, if you go to it's now the Foundry, which is the parent company that bought Luxology about 2 years ago. They're one of the leaders in visual effects. They make the famous compositing app called Nuke, as well as a bunch of other tools that are widely used within the visual effects and Hollywood communities for making special effects, like they were used on Avatar and all these other big-time productions. Anyway, Modo is now part of the Foundry, and which is kind of cool because the Foundry has some incredible talent there. Like each of their tools was acquired by, from other studios. For example, like their paint application was developed by Weta Digital during their making of like Avatar and Lord of the Rings. So like what happened was they had these genius programmers at Weta who then came up with this awesome paint tool for people to use, and then they developed it for their own production, and then basically the Foundry then bought it from them and then developed it further. So we're getting these awesome tools that are basically being used by these world-class, amazing Hollywood productions like Avatar and Lord of the Rings and so on. So I feel lucky that, I can use these tools, because a lot of these studios create these proprietary tools that then no one has access to except them. So as an independent artist, having access to those tools is like half the battle, and the other half being your own talent and being able to do something creative with it. But so Moto's just been a godsend for me, and the making of my characters and all the scenes in my book. I couldn't have done the illustrations without it, because literally I can't draw a stick figure to save my life. So if I didn't have these applications to create my artwork with, I would be in deep trouble. Like I wouldn't have been able to illustrate my book, or I'd have to have hired someone else to do it. Which I think wouldn't have been as good, because I had these visions in my head for what I wanted the book to look like. It was basically like a movie in my head, this book. And so I had a really, firm idea of what Aoleon looked like, what the Martians looked like, what the Martian megalopolis looked like, basically everything. I thought about it for a really long time, and the only way to really show that vision was to create it all myself, which was incredibly time consuming. And honestly, if I had to do it over again, I probably wouldn't do it, because it took me so long and it was so involved. But here I am. I started in 2003. Now, what is it, 2014? So it took me like 12 years to do this crazy thing. Anyway, what I'm showing you right now is the model in Moto for the Martian megalopolis. Now, this particular model, or this scene, I should say, took me 5 years, literally 5 years, to create everything in here. And in the process of it, I went through like 5 different Moto iterations. And it's funny, because I started in Moto 401, where they introduced replicators for the first time. And replicators are really what made making a big city scene like this possible, where I could create like, individual building models and then have them replicated hundreds of times without a major increase to memory footprint. Because literally I have thousands and thousands of buildings in this scene, and they're, it's just an astronomical number of buildings that are in this scene, and there's billions of polygons. Literally, like in the scene, there's over 50 billion polygons. So it's an insanely big scene. You've got everything from buildings to characters to spaceships flying around to floating platforms. I mean, there's literally everything that you see. And the reason why I did this, a lot of times, when you're in a production, you'd only shoot like one camera angle, and you'd only have like, the buildings you need for that specific scene. It would be like, a little facade, and then everything else behind it would be like nothing. And that saves resources. But I didn't want to do it that way. I wanted to actually create the entire city. And what that allowed me to do is basically fly my camera around like I'm doing right now, and put my camera anywhere I want in the entire city. And, I can have it down at the sidewalk level, at a street view, looking up at a building. I could have it flying over the city, so you see the whole thing in the backdrop. The way I set it up is I literally can put my camera anywhere I want. And even at the ground level, which is incredible, because the scale on this is immense. I mean, if you look at the scale size, which shows right here, it's 20 kilometers. That means that each little square is 20 kilometers. So, this gives you an idea of how big this scale is on this scene. It's really huge. So, the Martian megalopolis is broken up into different groups of buildings. You've got building replicators, where I've got various platforms, like you have the base platforms at the bottom, and then you've got these tall platforms, and then on top of those platforms, each one has different buildings, and each building had to be modeled. So I literally had to go in and model and texture every one of those buildings, and then I had to arrange them, and then I had to use replicators to replicate the buildings throughout the city plan. And that was for the entire megalopolis. And what you see here is basically the megalopolis. And I can spin around, and because it's in box view, I can basically put my camera anywhere I want. And then if I go to render view over here, right now I've got the camera setting right there. So let's turn down the resolution so it's not so big. Let's go down to let's say 2048. Whoops. What the heck? 2048. 1536. I was doing a spherical render, which is basically what you do when you're creating an environment map. One of the things I would do when I had lots of characters in the scene is I would take a spherical panoramic render of a spot within the Martian megalopolis. So what I would do is, like, for example, if I wanted to create a crowd scene, like in the beginning of, or the end of part 1, or the beginning of part 2, where Aoleon run into the Luminous in the crowd scene. Anyway, what I did for that was I set my camera down at a street level view within the megalopolis on one of the main streets, and then I created what's called a 360 degree panoramic render. And so I didn't have to have the Martian city scene in the same scene with all the characters. It saved me resources. So by creating a 360 degree panoramic render, I then could create a new scene and then import that 360 degree render and put my characters inside that, and I could spin my camera around any way I wanted and position it any way I wanted, and then it would save me the resources of having to have the entire city in the background. So anyway, that's basically that. And so it took me a really long time to create all these models, to come up with just even the concept ideas of like what everything looks like, from buildings to the characters to the weapons and props that they have to the clothing. I mean, everything had to be thought of and created, and that's part of the reason why it took me so long to write this book. But it was well worth it. I mean, I'm not looking to get rich from this thing, and I don't think I ever will, but it's my small contribution to the world of books and whatnot. And it also sort of, gave me a focus and a reason to perfect my artwork. So I think that basically answers the first question. So yeah, basically, I went through and just, there were so many great people. I would like to mention some people who were particularly helpful, especially in learning Modo. If you look in the thank you section of my book at the very end, you'll see that I thank a number of people. And there I thank the founders of Luxology and now the Foundry. And also there are a number of, so that's Brad Peebler, Alan Hastings, Stuart Ferguson, Gregory Dunsk, Matthew Craig, Mark Brown, Joe Angel, Arnie Coughlin, Jason Linhart, and Andrew Brown. Andrew Brown in particular, he was the guy who made a lot of the training for Modo, and he did a fabulous job. Thank you, Andrew. And then there was another program that I used to create basically all the planet renders of Mars, and literally I could not have created Mars at all without this piece of software. And that was PlanetSide's Terrigen. And Matt Faircloth, who's the proprietor and lead developer, allowed me to be part of their beta test team, which is sort of like an elite group of special effects artists that were invited to test out this awesome piece of software. And just to give you like a background on Terrigen, Matt started out as a developer for Digital Domain, which is one of the big effects houses that was based in Venice, California, and I believe was originally run by the director who created Avatar and what do you call it, Aliens and Titanic, Jim Cameron. So he was like the founder of Digital Domain, or one of the founders. Anyway, so Matt started his program Terrigen there, where he developed it in-house as basically a way to do terrain rendering. And the cool thing about Terrigen was that it enabled you to render an insane amount of polygons. Like, I mean, you can render an entire planet in this thing, and you get like the most amazing realistic views. So right now I'm going to open up Mars, and I'm going to open up a scene which is the top of Olympus Mons, the caldera in Olympus Mons, which is the very top, the crater of the planet, and that's where the Martian megalopolis is situated. So like here, Cydonia, okay. Wait, that's not it. Okay, that's another place. Let me open up. Okay, Olympus Mons, caldera. There we go. So I'm opening this up. And the cool thing about this program is that out of the box, it just gives you the most incredible environmental renders. Like, everything that it creates is just amazing. Okay, now you see it's saying here I'm getting an error about MOLA data files. I wanted to talk about the MOLA data set. MOLA is basically the Mars orbital, thingamajigger. It's the satellite that NASA put in orbit over Mars. I don't know, about in 2006 or 7, something like that. And it bounced laser beams off the surface of Mars and took fairly accurate terrain detail data for it. And basically what NASA did was they created this data set based on that data, that telemetry data that was sent from that satellite. And using that data, you can recreate a very accurate view of the Martian surface down to about, I don't know, maybe 10 meters square, something like that, or 100. I'm not exactly sure what the... There's different level of detail settings that you can do depending on the size of the model that you want to use, but the most highest detail one is extremely big and requires a lot of memory to process, but it's incredibly accurate. And so I actually was able to use the 128 and also the 64, depending on which one it was. The 128 was the biggest one, and the 64 was the medium-sized one. So depending on the scene I was rendering, I would choose one of the two. So anyway, let me just go here and pull up the MOLA data set. So here, where's the stupid MOLA? Let me just do a search real quick. MOLA. MOLA 64. Okay, here we go. So here's the MOLA 64 data set, and I'm going to load it in here. Okay. So now that the terrain data set is there, I should be able to let me see here. Okay. If you can see, this is Mars. Like, if I were to render this right now, Like, let me just back away. We're flying. This is an animation where we're actually flying into the planet, like from space, fly down into the planet. And we're coming at it from the dark side, so it's going to be mostly shaded. But if I were to render this, let me just turn on the atmosphere here. Let me make sure that's background. Okay, so it's all enabled. Let's see the full render size. Let's knock it down to 1600 by 1200. That way I can render it pretty quickly. All right, so we're doing a quick render here of Mars. And this just gives you an idea of what you can do with this program, which is just amazing. So basically what I did with Terragen was Matt created this awesome plugin that allows you to import the NASA MOLA data set, which was, again, the data that was collected from the Mars orbital whatever it's called thing, satellite. And so then you take that data and you import it into this thing, and it gives you an accurate, 100 meter level resolution terrain data set that you can then create the entire planet from. So it's not just like one part of Mars, like a little, 100-kilometer radius or square thing. It's the entire planet. So I can literally put my camera anywhere I want on the surface of Mars and get a fairly, accurate. I wouldn't say it's not like as good as what you're seeing from, the high-rise cameras or something like that, which is just incredibly detailed imagery. But, it's fairly good. It's like, at least from, a view from space is concerned, you're getting a pretty realistic, awesome looking image from it. And so that's the main reason why I used Terragen. And it was just absolutely fantastic to learn, and they were incredibly helpful for me. Especially Ocean Green, who is the business manager, as well as Joe Meter, who was the Mac developer. And I was sort of the Mac guy. All the other people were either on PC or Linux, mostly PC. And so I was like the only Mac guy who was really testing it. And so, every build, Joe would make a Mac build, and then I would test it, and then I would give feedback on it. And usually the app is just rock solid. I mean, they do such a good job of testing and making sure everything's stable that most of the time, there's no crashes. I mean, I had maybe, 5 or 6 crashes over the 7-year period that I was using the application, which is really unheard of for any application, especially a 3D app. So it's incredibly stable, incredibly well made, and reliable. And it creates these incredible images of Mars, which I was just lucky to have. So unfortunately, it takes a really long time. The render is a little bit slow, but the imagery when it comes out is just amazing. So I feel very fortunate to be a part of the beta test team. Thank you, Matt and Joe and Ocean. And anyway, that's basically it for how I created my... Oh, one last thing is, how did I composite it all? Well, I used After Effects, which is made by Adobe, and Photoshop. And it's kind of unusual. I just want to talk about this for a minute. Most special effects houses or animation companies like Pixar or DreamWorks or whatever, when they're doing a show or a movie, they render everything in multiple passes. And this may be a little technical for you guys listening, but what a pass is basically where you take each element within a scene and it's rendered separately, rather than like you would have a camera and you would take a picture of something and everything is in the camera at the same time. That's the opposite of that, where basically you have everything that's rendered separately, and then you bring it together into what's called a compositing app. Like the Foundry, for example, makes one of the high-end compositing apps called Nuke, that's used by many of the major studios. I didn't use Nuke for this project because, to be honest, it was a little beyond me, and I needed something simple, and so I used Photoshop primarily, and also After Effects. And so what it allowed me to do is basically just bring in my imagery, tweak it a little bit, like gamma correction, color correction, add some lens flares here or there, and basically I was done, which is unheard of for most people that make these images. Basically, when you're a Pixar or you're a DreamWorks or an ILM or something like that, they render every little thing in the scene separately, and they sometimes even have multiple passes for each thing. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, if you have, I don't know, a character in a scene, that character would be rendered separately, and then there might be a different pass for the color, just the color on him. There would be another pass for the specular highlights, which are the little glints on his skin or his, the metal on his armor or whatever it may be, and reflections or, anything, so the environment, the glow of the atmosphere, all of that stuff would be rendered separately, and then it would be brought together in what's called a compositing app to make the final image, where they can then tweak each little thing separately to really hone in on what they want for the final image. And it's much more time consuming when you do it that way, because you literally have to render 50 or 100 different images just to make one image. And for me, that was just too much. Like, I just wanted to have everything look good pretty much in camera, which is kind of unheard of. And that's sort of kudos to both Luxology and now the Foundry for making Moto with this amazing built-in real-time renderer, and to Matt Fairclough, maker of Terrigen, because the great thing about these two apps is that they create amazing imagery right in camera. Like, as you can see here, we're looking at the periphery of Mars as it's backlit by the sun. So we're on the dark side, peering towards the light, which is kind of cool. And then you see the Milky Way in the background. So that's just one image, and I can zoom in all the way down to the planet's surface and get a really high detailed view of the planet. Hey, sweetie. This is Xena, by the way, my kitty. She's in my book. Hi, Xena. Anyway, so I just wanted to give you an overview of what these apps are like and what they do and how I use them to make my imagery. So the final part, which is what I was talking about, which is compositing, I permanently did in Photoshop. So example, here's the cover image that I'm working on for the print and hardcover books for part 3. And you can see that I've got everything in layers. Like, I've got the background, I've got, the effects right there. I've got the skyboard rendered separately. I've got Gilbert rendered separately, so everything is broken. And that's what I was talking about by rendering in passes, where you have every little element rendered separately, and then you bring it in layers. And that allows you to tweak each layer separately to make it just right. So this is, right now I'm working trying to get my book covers done, because they're not done. And I've got my ebooks out on Amazon right now, but I need to get the paperback and hardcover versions done. And so that's sort of what I'm doing right now primarily. So I'm trying to get those finished. But I just wanted to show you how I composite an image, for example. And, so each element would then be color corrected. I do a gamma correction, color correction. Like, if the color wasn't exactly right, I would shift the hue a little bit, or make it a little richer, make it a little lighter, whatever it may need to look good. And that's basically it. I mean, it seems complex, but actually, compared to what most of the major studios do, it's incredibly simple. And that was the awesome thing about Moto and, Planetside's Terrigen, was it allowed me to basically render everything in camera and have it look awesome in camera. So I don't have to create 100 passes for each scene and then tweak every pass to get the desired look I want. Basically, it was 90% there when I hit render, and it only have to render it once, which is awesome. So that's kudos to the makers of Moto and kudos to the makers of Terrigen. So thank you guys, and thank you for listening. Sorry I took so long and rambled on about this stuff, but I wanted to give you like an in-depth overview of basically how I make my images and what's involved. So thanks for listening, and if you have any other questions, go ahead and shoot me an email, Aoleon at aoleonthemartiangirl.com. Thanks, and I hope you enjoy the books.